Good afternoon. I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to speak with all of you today about my debut novel, Valentine. I was advised not to tell any library stories because apparently y'all hear a million of them. So I will just say this: the bookmobile in my hometown saved my life. So thank you for the work you do. Unless you closely follow high school football or have ties to the oil and gas industry, you've probably never heard of my hometown of Odessa, Texas. Odessa is a smallish city that feels like a smallish town located in the vast oil-rich region known as the Permian Basin. Sometimes described by locals as 300 miles from everywhere, 300 miles from Dallas, 300 miles from El Paso, 300 miles from Austin. It is a flat, treeless landscape covered with mesquite trees and caliche and barbed wire, rattlesnakes and rats, drilling rigs and pump jacks. There's an old joke that West Texans love to tell newcomers. Why did God give oil to West Texas? To make up for what he did to the land. But for all its geographic isolation, it is also a region that has an outsized impact on politics, the global economy, and most of all, the climate crisis. And now, due to increased fracking and horizontal drilling, the Permian Basin is on track to become the largest oil producer in the world, outpacing Saudi Arabia and bringing with it the disastrous consequences of the disastrous consequences for the region and the planet, and for those who live and work there and call the place home. In some ways, I'm writing about a Texas that thankfully no longer exists. Texas is better now. I know, but it really is. It's more complicated, it's more diverse, more voices are being heard. Politically, culturally, artistically, people are starting to grapple with the history of the state in more honest ways. And in other ways, ways that profoundly affect the citizens and the planet, Texas hasn't changed a bit. My hometown still suffers from systemic racism and xenophobia. And although a slight majority, about 52% of citizens in my hometown identify as Latinx, a major demographic shift since 1976 when my book is set, depressingly low rates of voter turnout, most likely due to disenfranchisement and voter intimidation, mean there is not a single person with a Latinx surname on the city council. For many reasons, then, when I began my book, which for several years I did not dare to call a novel or a story collection or anything really other than my book, I decided it would be set in a town called Capernaum, a stand-in for my hometown, much in the same way that Talia was a stand-in for Larry McMurtry's hometown of Archer City, Texas, which is about 300 miles from Odessa. I chose Capernaum because there are no other towns in Texas with that name, which is a challenge, and because it is mentioned in the New Testament as a place of faithlessness, as well as the hometown of several prophets. Thankfully, I quickly jettisoned this idea. I was a weird kid. I suspect that every time a writer gives a talk about the origins of her book, it should maybe begin with those 5 words, maudlin and somewhat solitary in a place that prizes sociability and at least surface optimism, especially in girls and women, even now. And in addition to reading voraciously, I spent a good portion of my childhood eavesdropping on my mom and her girlfriends as they sat on the back porch after dinner with their cigarettes and mixed drinks, rehashing their days and bitching about the heat, their bosses, husbands, us kids. I knew their voices as well as I knew the terrain, the dust and oil derricks, the relentless sun and heat, the graft and violence that comes with each and every oil boom, the raw desperation that takes hold when the bottom falls out of the oil markets. I knew the cadences of their speech, the lifts and dips, the elongated vowels and extra syllables that distinguish a West Texas drawl from other regional accents, the seemingly random additions of S's at the ends of words, the musicality of asking how come instead of why. It is a drawl that is beginning to disappear, that is heard less and less often in the voice of anyone under the age of 40. And the book also had its origins in the voices of the girls I ran around town with when I was older. Girls who shouted and fought and would gladly kick your ass if you looked at them sideways. Girls who pilfered beer and weed money from their mother's purses or the till at work, then drove out to the oil fields and dared each other to climb up on the drilling platform. Girls who got pregnant and pulled their money, then drove 300 miles to the clinic. Who dreamed of going to college or at least to someplace else, but had no idea how to make that happen. Who sometimes wondered if they would live to see 30 and then didn't. But it turns out that knowing those voices doesn't necessarily mean knowing the characters in ways that are complicated enough to tell their stories. And growing up in a place doesn't necessarily mean that you know the place or you can see it clearly. It took me a lot of years and a lot of miles to be able to write this book, to be able to love these complicated, profoundly flawed characters enough to tell their stories in the ways that they deserve to be told, which is, after all, the same as any story. It must be true and it must be honest, especially if it's fiction. The book also has its origins in the voices that I learned to listen to when the oil boom left, and it always does. The high, quiet, thin cry of the plant whistle when there was an accident out of the plant, the sound of my father's boots walking down the hall in the middle of the night, the quiet that sets in when the rigs shut down and the trucks are all gone and jobs become scarce, when people leave town in droves, when you're able to hear the odd, ugly cry of the sandhill cranes that pause on their annual migration, the wind shuffling through the blue grama grasses. Because I also wanted to write a book about a place worth saving in spite of the damage it's done to the planet and continues to do. I wanted to write characters who are profoundly flawed, who need to say they're sorry, who need badly to have an honest reckoning with who they are and where they're from and who their people are and were. In the near-perfect short story by Dennis Johnson called Emergency, to the horror of nurses and doctors in the emergency room, a drug-addled orderly who has no business being at work reaches across a gurney and pulls out a knife that is lodged in a patient's eye. Later, when Georgie is asked what it is he does for a living, he replies, "I save lives." He is, to say the least, an unlikely hero. In other words, he is the stuff of books. I was reminded of that story recently when I read Oscar Casardas' beautiful, quiet, and deeply humane new novel, Where We Come From, in which a most ordinary character, a woman with few resources and a lifetime spent towing the line, finds herself cast into a situation that requires her at great personal risk to save the lives of the strangers who come to her door. This is one aim of poetry and prose, I think, to remind each and every one of us that it is possible in ways to act in ways that may seem impossibly noble, to show us characters who cannot imagine they are up to the task of heroism. And you know, I think I'll just stop there, actually. That's my book. I'm just going to read a paragraph to y'all, if you don't mind. It's super short, because honestly, I'd like for the book to speak for itself. So this is the second to last chapter, and this part I'm going to read isn't going to give anything away. And it's told in the point of view of a young woman, Carla. She's 17 years old and a waitress, and she is really hoping for a better life for herself and her daughter. We lose the men when they try to beat the train and their pickup trucks stall on the tracks, or they get drunk and accidentally shoot themselves, or they get drunk and climb the water tower and fall 10 stories to their deaths. During cutting season, when they stumble in the chute and a bull calf roars and kicks them in the heart. On fishing trips, when they drown in the lake or fall asleep at the wheel on the drive home. Pile up on the interstate, shooting at the Dixie Motel, hydrogen sulfide leak outside Gardendale. Looks like somebody came down with a fatal case of the stupid, Evelyn says when one of the regulars shares the news at happy hour. Those are the usual ways, the ordinary days. But now it is the 1st of September and the Bone Spring Shale is coming back into play. Now we will also lose them to crystal and coke and painkillers. We will lose them to slipped drill bits or unsecured stacks of pipeline or fires caused by vapor clouds. And the women, how do we lose them? Usually, it's when one of the men kills them. In the spring of 1962, just after natural gas fields were discovered out near Wink, Evelyn likes to tell new hires, one of her waitresses clocked out, rolled up her apron, and carried it with her into the bar to knock back a few with the regulars. The woman's car was still in the parking lot when Evelyn locked up that night, and it sat there for nearly a week before they found her body. At an abandoned oil lease, Evelyn says, because that's where you always find the bodies. Bastards set her on fire, too. You don't get used to knowing something like that. Evelyn is small and wound tight with forearms like Sissel and a beehive the color of ripe plums. The next gas fields will be even bigger than Wink, she tells us at the weekly staff meeting. Start your engines, gals. Get ready to make bank. Keep your eyes peeled for the next serial killer.